Renewed clashes in the Syrian city of Aleppo between the army and Kurdish fighters are undermining efforts to achieve national unity. The violence erupted after a failure to implement a deal on incorporating fighters of the Syrian Democratic Forces into the army. Can tension be contained this time? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Thousands of residents in Aleppo have been forced to flee. This week's violence brings with it a sense of deja vu. This time it's the result of more fighting between the Syrian army and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. It reflects a deep rift between the two sides, and many rounds of talks have so far failed to reach common ground. The SDF seeks a decentralized system of government with areas under its control having a certain level of autonomy. But the government in Damascus wants to centralize power. As the two sides blame each other for another round of violence, we'll discuss the fallout with our guests in a moment. First, this report from Michael Apple.
The echoes of war have returned to Aleppo. Syrian government forces are amassing troops and military hardware in the city after a flare-up in violence with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. Thousands are fleeing through humanitarian corridors with a curfew now in place.
We live in the Ashrafiyah neighborhood. The situation is very bad there. We went out into the fighting and bombing. God saved us.
The escalating tensions follow unsuccessful talks between the sides on following through with a March agreement to integrate the SDF's estimated 50,000 fighters into the national army. The deadline for that process was the end of December. Aleppo's been the scene of constant tension, and in early October the US brokered a ceasefire between the SDF and government forces there. Damascus says the SDF has also failed to abide by an April agreement to withdraw from these two Kurdish-majority neighborhoods. The SDF coalition controls large parts of northeastern Syria, including areas along the Turkish border, covering nearly a third of the country, including regions rich in natural resources like oil. Turkey has offered its support to Damascus as it looks to dislodge the SDF from Aleppo. Ankara views the armed group as the Syrian extension of the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, and internally designates it as a terrorist organization. Aleppo is still coming to terms with some of the bloodiest fighting of the civil war more than a decade ago. Fighting that decimated neighborhoods and killed tens of thousands. Those who've seen all-out war before are scared of where this latest escalation could lead, with the shadow of renewed conflict looming. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss this further with our panel of experts who are joining us today. From London, Labib Nahhas, he's a Syria analyst. From the Turkish capital, Ankara, Omer Oz-key-zill-chick, non-resident fellow for the Syria Project in the Atlantic Council's Middle East programme. And also from London, Rob Geist Pinfold, who's a lecturer in international security at King's College London. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. So let's just start with where we are at the moment. 13 months since the fall of Assad. It was always going to be rocky after 50 years of an Assad, more than 50 years of an Assad dynasty and then a civil war. But if I can ask you, Labib, as you look at where we are now, how serious is this moment right now?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Going straight to your point or to your question, I think we potentially could be at either an inflection point or even a turning point. There is no doubt, as you said from the beginning, that the month after the fall of the regime would be very rocky, very unstable. And right now what we have is a very fragile security situation. And undoubtedly SDF is one of the big issues that the new authorities in Damascus are facing. Now, what we're witnessing today really is a continuation or a repeated pattern of how the negotiations and the engagement between the Syrian authorities and SDF has been going on for almost a year right now, since the agreement of March last year. What happened in Aleppo in the last few hours or a day now is the response of the Syrian authorities to certain provocations from the SDF forces. Now, the situation is very critical, not for the gravity of the incidents so far in terms of the scale of the military confrontation, although we already have 50 to 60,000 displaced people, but the fact that there is a danger of this situation escalating further across the Syrian geography, more groups getting engaged in this confrontation, namely the regime remnants and loyalists who has been like developing a very close relationship with SDF lately, and what looms in the horizon, and it's a very kind of bad example, is what happened in Sueda. This is the big risk that the authorities face right now. If they don't carefully manage not only the execution of the military operation, but also the narrative and the engagement with the Kurdish population itself, and try to finalize and end this operation in a very measured and swift manner, then yes, we are facing the risk of major escalation, and things could get out of control, not only in Aleppo, but across many areas in Syria.
You mentioned Sueda, which is in the south of Syria, and that's where there were clashes between the army and the government forces and the Druze. Rob, I mean, the basic origin of this is the fact that Assad, when he started cracking down on the uprising, people responded and different groups took control of different parts of Syria, and Syria became divided and fragmented. But perhaps you could just, for our viewers, give us a little bit more on who the SDF are, the Syrian Democratic Forces, because we say Kurdish-led, they're not entirely Kurdish, are they?
Yes, you're right on all of your points there, James. What we're seeing here is the legacy of Syria's very long, brutal and bloody civil war, where, yes, we have a central government in Damascus, but Syria is still a country with far too many guns and far too many separate militias, all with divergent aims and goals. Now, we also know that many of those militias are divided along ethno-religious or sectarian lines. We've heard about the Druze in Sueda. We have also the Alawite militias on the coast, who are sometimes described as regime remnants, rightly or wrongly. And then also we have the SDF. Now, the SDF is a very different kettle of fish to the other two, in that this is a group with very robust and strong ties to the West. It's seen as the West's premier partner in Syria. During the days of the Assad regime, it was the SDF who were the front line in the fight against ISIL. They were seen very much as the quote-unquote good guys in Syria's civil war, again, rightly or wrongly, but they were seen as the group that were most committed to something approaching secularism and pluralism, the sort of things that we like to hear about in the West. So that is why this group has such name recognition in Western capitals and support in Washington, London, and elsewhere. Though the problem, of course, is that now Western interests have shifted. There's this perception that actually the al-Shara regime in Damascus is a government with whom we could and should be doing business. We've seen an increased closeness between Western capitals and the al-Shara regime. So the SDF has lost its monopoly as the one group that Western forces support. And now we're sort of seeing the development of Washington's worst nightmare, where two groups with whom it has very, very robust relations and it wants to get on, and it wants them to get on with each other, the SDF and the Syrian government, are now at loggerheads and are on a collision course. And that only seems to be escalating. Remember, the US is involved here in mediating. They are trying to work towards a ceasefire. They mediated a previous agreement in April that the Syrian government accuses the SDF of breaking in Aleppo. So this is very much the US's worst nightmare. And I suspect they'll be working very hard behind the scenes to try and de-escalate, or at least get to a ceasefire.
Omer, if you could pick it up from there, the international community seems to have decided the best thing for Syria is to be a totally unified country, because it could have said, federalism was a good idea and the SDF could have some limited autonomy in their area. Why have they gone against that? And is it because of where you are, because of the influence of Turkey in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, let me be frank. Turkey definitely played a role in how the international narrative shaped, but we also have to address clearly that demographics play here an important role. In northeastern Syria, there is no continued Kurdish majority region. I mean, all of the Kurdish majority areas in northeastern Syria are separated from each other by Arab majority territories. And even the SDF controlled territories are 80% majority Arab. And here I have to underline something. If we speak about the SDF, it was quite interesting for me to not hear the issue of the SDF being linked to the PKK. According to the former US Special Envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey, the SDF is the Syrian offshoot of the PKK.
Okay, let's just bring viewers around the world. Some of them will not follow this. So the SDF, which is also gets very bit of an alphabet soup here, has elements who are substantial elements who are the YPG, which are Kurdish fighters, and the allegation certainly is that the YPG is actually part of the PKK, which is the Kurdish Workers' Party in Turkey, which has been for a long time, or had been for a long time, fighting the Turkish state. Correct?
Yeah, but I would even go further and say that within the SDF, the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK designated foreign terrorist organization, is the main bulk. I mean, except for the YPG, there aren't any real influential elements inside the SDF that have a say. I mean, most of the non-YPG elements in the SDF are forced conscripts. The SDF is forcefully recruiting young Arab men into its ranks and forcing them to bear arms and to hold the front line. So there is a forced conscription here in Syria. And the international community's approach to Syria to preserve its territorial integrity, to have a strong centralized government in Syria, is actually a reflection of the desire of the Syrian people as well. The Syrian people have strongly shown the world that they don't want to divide their country. And actually, we have seen that these forms of federalism, quota systems, decentralization, that they don't work. We have seen what it leads to in Lebanon. We have seen what it leads to in Libya, in Sudan, in Iraq. In the government, together with the regional state, the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Egypt, they also don't support Syria to be divided across ethnic and sectarian lines. The only country that supports Syria's fragmentation as of now is Israel.
Okay. Labib, this was supposed to be sorted out by diplomacy. You mentioned it earlier on in your answer. March the 10th of last year, there was an agreement signed between President al-Shara and the head of the SDF. Why did that unravel, or were the SDF never really serious? They were just trying to delay this?
I think there's a variety of reasons. The first one could be some intrinsic elements of the agreement itself, where it was very quickly cooked at the back of the events that happened in the coast back in March as well. And this move was hugely pushed, organized, and supported by the United States, and almost forced both sides to sit down and have this agreement as a mitigation measure to what happened in the coast and the clashes that took place in March. So it wasn't properly conceived. It lacked the mechanisms of monitoring. It lacked a very clear roadmap and a timeline of how it be implemented. But I think fundamentally, the issue here is that there are two colliding and totally opposing state models that each side are fighting for. So the Syrian authorities are fighting for the traditional or advocating for the traditional state model that has ruled Syria for many decades, which is a very strong, centralized government that controls the entire geography of the country. Now, within that control, it has been conceived in the last few months, and within a lot of discussions and interactions between different elements of the Syrian society and the political spectrum, is that there is a room for administrative kind of federalism, administrative control of certain areas, which could be beneficial for Syria at this point in time. On the other hand, what SDF is advocating for is a full autonomous control of the territories that it controls, which, back to the point that your guest Omer was making, there is an impossibility and lack of viability to have this integrity of a fully controlled autonomous area, because it does not contain a homogeneous kind of demography. And the claim that SDF is making regarding representing the interests and the voice of the Kurdish minority is untrue. So not only they want full autonomy, even their integration, which was a fundamental and the essential part of the March agreement, their integration in the military, in the army, in the Ministry of Defense, they are asking and demanding to be as a bloc, not as individuals. So they're asking specifically to have 3 separate divisions within the Syrian army. Basically, they're asking for a state within a state. And this is something that Damascus cannot accept, and it will kind of constitute a very negative precedence, in a sense that we are accepting autonomous authorities and control in Syria based on ethnic or religious background. So
okay.
I think
let me bring in Rob, if I can now. The Syrian army has declared areas that have a big Kurdish population, 2 areas, Sheikh, Maqsoud and Ashrafiyah, as closed military areas. We've had clashes. It looks possibly like we might be about to have a battle. If that were to take place, what is your feeling on the relative strengths of the 2 sides here? Because the SDF, of course, for a long time was supplied and supported by the US. It has US equipment. The Syrian army, which in itself is made up of lots of different groups that were separate groups before. Where do you think the power lies between these 2? Because my understanding is neither really has any effective air power right now.
Well, absent external intervention, as we saw in Sweden with the Israeli intervention, this would be a bloody yet a one-sided battle. Remember that the SDF has pulled out officially its forces in an April agreement from Aleppo. So what's left is what's known as the Asayich, the internal security forces of the SDF. Many people view that this militia is basically a front for the PKK, or contains PKK fighters disproportionately compared to other SDF divisions and units. So these are groups that are not going to go down easily. They're not going to go down without a fight, but those neighborhoods will be easily surrounded by Syrian government forces, and they'd be those Kurdish groups will be far outnumbered and outmatched. Yes, the SDF on paper has 50,000 fighters. The overwhelming majority of those are concentrated in the east of the country, where we have yet to see, thankfully, the level of hostilities that we're seeing in Aleppo. And what's interesting here is that the Syrian regime seems to be learning from its previous engagements, from the coastal massacres in March of last year, and also in the violence in Sweden. We came to the conclusion after those events that whenever you see a large-scale deployment of Syrian security forces, violence against civilians, ethno-religious sectarian violence, tends to follow. So the government here seems to be acting so far much more smartly in terms of allowing the Kurdish and non-Kurdish residents of those neighborhoods to evacuate, in targeting specific areas. We have not seen so far a mass mobilization of clans or various militias outside of central government control, and it was those mass mobilizations that led to a lack of command and control, which then ended in those horrifying massacres amongst the Druze.
Robbie, you've mentioned those clashes that have taken place in the south and on the coast with the Alawite community, and the south with the Druze community. I want to bring in another element to this, the other problem that I think President al-Shara has faced over the last year, an average of 2 attacks a day from Israel. Now, there's been fresh talks between Israel and Syria in recent hours taking place in Paris. Let me read you the statement brokered by the US. Let me read you what the State Department put out on behalf of the US and the 2 sides. They said both sides have decided to establish a joint fusion mechanism, a dedicated communication cell to facilitate immediate and ongoing coordination on their intelligence sharing, military de-escalation. This mechanism will serve as a platform to address any disputes promptly and work to prevent misunderstanding. Omer, do you think it solved the Israel problem? Do you think President al-Shara can breathe easily now, or do you think Israel still wants to take territory and destabilize the national government?
I mean, when I met the Syrian president and asked him exactly such a question, he said, if you ask me if I trust Israel, he said, no, he doesn't. And I think the Syrian side has ample reason to be skeptical about this process. We have seen in the past that Israel green-lighted initially the Syrian military intervention into Sueda in the south that was being spoken about. And then they bombed the Syrian army afterwards, despite the green light. And here, the Syrian side has reason to doubt. But there is little to no alternative for the Syrian government. What should they do? The Israeli aggressions are very intense and the threat from Israel is real. So therefore, they are seeking to reach a ceasefire resolution, and having the Americans involved, 724, and having them supervise this is maybe the only way to achieve a real ceasefire. So fingers crossed, but the Syrian side has reasons to doubt, because we have seen in the past that Israel has not only violated agreements, ceasefire agreements in Syria, but also in Lebanon, in Gaza, in regards to Iran, they have done this. And the Israeli side has been quite aggressive and not the country most known to uphold international agreements. But fingers crossed, because the Americans are now involved directly.
Well, let me ask you, Labib, about the Americans, because as we said, you know, there have been attacks so regularly in 2025 by Israel. One assumes that someone in the administration was green-lighting some of that. Where do you think the administration stands? There were talks taking place in Paris. You had people like the US ambassador to Turkey, Thomas Barak, involved. He's the point man on Syria as well. He seems to be close to President al-Shara, but also people like Jared Kushner, who has very good relations with the Israelis. Do you think there is actually potentially a little bit of a division in the US administration on where to go?
I think there's always been the case regarding Syria, not only now, but if I go back and if I deviate a little bit from your question and go back to the SDF issue, because it addresses the big elephant in the room, which is the U.S. In the past, in 2017, when during President Trump's first presidency, when he signaled clearly that the U.S. intended to withdraw from Syria and abandon SDF, the next day, SDF were negotiating with the Assad regime. So if the SDF are currently holding a very tough negotiating position, they must feel somehow, or they must have some assurances that the US is backing them up, despite the official narrative. And I believe that the US is interested in a centralized government ruling the entire geography. But within that broad title, there's a lot of room for what type of government, what type of state we have. And this is where SDF is getting a leeway, I think. So back to the Israeli issue, I have to say that the whole agreement is really bizarre. It talked about intelligence sharing, it talked about de-escalation, it talked about diplomatic engagement, and oddly enough about commercial and economic opportunities, which might sound more as a normalization more than a security agreement. So the question in the case of the Israeli agreement is, how much control does the U.S. have over Israel, which we've seen in other occasions that wasn't that much. And the other thing is, this agreement really, if we can call it an agreement, did not address any of the key issues that we have. So there is no mechanism to stop or de-escalate the incursions and the attacks. There's no mechanism to address the wider security framework that both sides were talking about. So I think we just have to wait and see really how much of that translates into reality on the ground. And let's not forget that 48 hours after that agreement, the Israelis escalated diplomatically, and they described the attack of the Syrian authorities against SDF as a dangerous, a serious attack against the Kurdish minorities. So far, we have not seen any effect, and we have to wait and see how it will play out.
Rob, the front line as we speak is in the second city of Syria, Aleppo, one of the oldest inhabited cities on earth. And there's something awful about that, isn't it? Because it's the place, all of Syria suffered so badly during the war, but Aleppo arguably suffered the worst, divided, the population bombed by the Russians, barrel bombs from the Assad regime, and it's all back in Aleppo again now.
Yes, that's exactly right. This is very much stirring up echoes of the past. And part of the problem here is the lack of basically ending the chapter of the Syrian civil war. That will take a very, very long time. And we're seeing the failure to do so, the inability of the government to do so, playing out across Syria today. Many, for example, new jihadist groups are trying to legitimize themselves by taking vigilante action against former Assad regime individuals or alleged Assad regime individuals, most of whom are from the Alawite community. So that's the sectarian violence. We're hearing talk, of course, of Assad regime remnants or Alawite militias along the coast receiving increasing support from Assad regime figure exiles in Russia, but also, of course, in Lebanon. And then, of course, we have this Kurdish issue, the SDF issue that's playing out, of course, not just in Aleppo, but in eastern Syria as well. And there are echoes of great power politics here as well. Something interesting that's not been mentioned so far is that the SDF in Aleppo specifically were actually closer to Russia than they were to the United States. So that could be a factor in the government's considerations here as well. But just one shred of optimism, and I think it's worth noting that, is that no party at the moment actually wants an open war between the SDF and the Syrian government. Turkey has put a lot of effort into rebuilding and stabilizing Syria. It's put a lot of effort into outreach to the Kurds beyond Syria. That would violence would jeopardize both of those strategies. The Syrian government wants to rebuild and reconstruct. It's just had sanctions lifted. So regardless of whether those sanctions are lifted or not, no one's going to invest in Syria if Syria is a quagmire of violence. And the SDF sees very much an existential threat here. The balance of power is shifting against it, both locally and geopolitically. So it's in no one's interest for this to end in an open war between the SDF and government forces. The hope is that it stays surgical, it stays local, and it's limited in time in Aleppo, and it ends in a ceasefire soon.
Well, thank you for ending us on a note of slight optimism there, Rob. Thank you to our guests today, Labib Nahhas, Omer Oz-key-zill-chick, and Rob Geist Pinfold. For more coverage, stay tuned to Al Jazeera. We have teams on the ground in Aleppo and Damascus, and there's more detail and context on our website, aljazeera.com. We'd like to hear from you as always. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X. Our username there is @AJ Inside Story. I'll be back in this chair very soon. Until then, from me, James Bays, and all the team here, stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.